What's going on, my good people? Mike Hidalgo here. Thank you for joining us on another FCP Euro DIY. Today, we're going to be working on a 2008 Porsche Cayenne Turbo. Today on the Cayenne behind me, we're going to be covering how to replace your upper and lower control arms. This DIY is going to be applicable to the Cayennes, the Touaregs, and the Q7s as well. On the site, we have a couple different options for control arm kits, including TRW and Mila. Today, we're using the Mila ones as they both come with hardware included to do these jobs, and the lower arms are part of the Mila HD lineup, which is going to be great for this off-road rig. Typically, you want to replace these anywhere between 70 to 100,000 miles. It all depends on the kind of terrain that your vehicle is used to. If you're familiar with our Cayenne, you know that she's been on some rougher roads than most, so you can imagine 140,000 miles, original control arms. They're pretty toasty. A couple other things to look for is uneven tire wear. Usually if your control arm ball joints or either or are bad, you'll have some uneven tire wear. If you go get an alignment, sometimes they won't be able to do a proper alignment as the bushings have too much play in them. So those are just a couple things to take into consideration. Of course, sounds. Just keep in mind, sounds can come from bushings, they can come from bad ball joints, and other suspension related components in that same area. So take a pry bar, pry around, see what you got to do to find out what's wrong. Now that we know what we're working with today and what to look out for, let's take a look at some of the tools we're going to need for this job. For this job, we have a couple of tools that we're going to need, starting with wrenches. I have a lot of doubles here. It's not so much that we're using a lot of different sizes. We have 2 16s, 2 18s, 2 21s, and 122. We have a non-OEM bolt, which I'll show you in a little bit. For sockets, it's the same thing. We only have a couple sizes. I just have a bunch of different depths. We have a 17 millimeter for our wheel lug bolts, a 6 millimeter hex for our counter hold on our ball joints. We have a 10 millimeter socket, a 16, an 18, and a 21, again in different sizes. Extensions, we have a couple different extensions for the 1/2 inch and 3/8 drive ratchets. We have a T25. We have a 12 millimeter flared wrench. That's going to come in handy for the airlines. We have a different array of flathead screwdrivers and picks, as well as a 1/4 inch punch, which we'll show you where that comes in handy as well. Got a couple different hammers for the ball joint removal process, as well as a pickle fork. A pry bar is always handy to have, and a flashlight when doing this job. And then your standard 3/8 ratchet and torque wrenches as well. A couple nice to haves but not necessary are electric ratchets, electric impacts, a paint marker, and obviously some sort of penetrating oil. Not pictured on our table is a floor jack with a small piece of wood, which we'll show you later on how we use, and 2 screw jacks, which simulate floor jacks for us when we're up in the air. Now that we have a list of what we're going to be working with, let's get started on this DIY. All right, before we get started, the most important thing on this Cayenne is going to be to put it into lift mode. This is an air-equipped vehicle, so we do have to make sure that the suspension system is off. That way it doesn't try to level itself out while it's up in the air. If your car is equipped with coil suspension, this is not a necessary step. So to do so, we're going to put the key in the ignition, put it on the on position or position 2, and we're going to hold the lift button for about, it takes about 55 seconds to a minute depending. And we're just going to wait for a message to come on the screen saying that the vehicle air suspension has been turned off. I'll say lift mode on. All right, my good people, today we're going to be working on the lift. However, this is a job you can do in your driveway or in the garage with a couple floor jacks and jack stands. We have our car situated up in the air. Our first step of business is going to be to remove the wheel. On this car, we have 5 17 millimeter lug bolts, so let's zap those off. Now with the wheel off, we can take a look at what we're working with. Our next step of business, so we can see a little bit better, is going to be to remove our fender liner. So let's get started with that. All right, first step of business to get the fender liner off is going to be to remove 10 T25 bolts all around. Ours is missing a couple, but you should have about 10. We're starting the fender liner arch. Now that we have our hardware off, we can go ahead and pull the fender liner down. Just be mindful if you're working on the ground. Oftentimes these are notorious for trapping a bunch of road debris and dirt and rocks. You don't want them falling in your face. Don't mind the tape here. Yours should hopefully not have this. With that off, now we have a whole view of what's going on under the fender liner here. Next thing is going to be just to do a quick inspection of where everything is. We have our upper control arm. We have our lower control arm down here. Now our next move is going to be to prep everything around the strut for removal, starting by disconnecting a bunch of electrical connectors as well as our air line. So let's get started with that. Now we're going to go ahead and start by removing our grommets that tie in our electricals to the suspension components, as well as disconnecting them. So let's get started with that. These give you a hard time, just twist them like that and usually they'll come out. Now we can work on disconnecting our brake pad wear sensor. Twist this 90 degrees to get it out of its holding clamp. So you can see accidentally pulling this disconnected our ABS sensor, but this is usually located right by your tie rod end on this end of the rotor, opposite from the caliper. You can take these off and just tuck them up to the side. And then we have one more sensor over here that goes into our strut. Same connection as the one on our wear sensor. I just used the pick to pry this up a little bit, makes pulling these out a little bit easier. Next on the list is going to be disconnecting this airline. If you have one, use a flared wrench. That way it wraps around the whole fitting and you lessen the chance of stripping it. Otherwise, you can take your chances with a normal wrench. Just figure out what size it is first. Some of these vary. In this case, a 12 millimeter flared wrench fits the best. We're going to go ahead and break it free. Don't be alarmed if you start hearing air escaping. That's going to happen. Now there is one more electrical connector which we're going to get to once our strut is a little bit more available to us. So just keep that in mind. It's the ride height sensor one. But next step on our list is going to be to disconnect this ball joint. So using an 18 millimeter socket or wrench, whatever you have handy to you, I'm going to zap that off. I'm going to use an impact with an 18 millimeter socket just to speed things up a bit. Now we're going to go ahead and use a pickle fork to separate the ball joint from the upper arm. One thing to note is if you're taking this apart and you're going to be reusing this ball joint, you're going to try to be careful with this. I don't think there's a good way to save these if you're using a pickle fork, but just wanted to put that out there. Boom, baby. A couple things I want to point out while I have you here. One, if you note the orientation of the control arm while it's sitting in its assembly still, or the strut tower housing, it's got almost, well, these are a little worn, so it shouldn't have this much play in it, but it's got almost a 90-degree angle to it from the strut itself. This is where you want to set up your new arm once we're doing the assembly process of everything, but just wanted to point out what that's kind of look like, because you want to tighten these at quote-unquote ride height when the vehicle is at its normal low position. With that done, our next step is going to be to go ahead and disconnect this level sensor now that we have a better view of it. So let's go ahead and get that taken care of. To disconnect this sensor, you have a tab on the top and the bottom. They're a little bit tricky. You're going to want to play with it a little bit. Squeeze it, push in, and pull out until you can get it. If you need to, grab a pick to help just kind of separate these plastics a bit. I'm using a right angle pick to kind of help me. You can see how I lift up the tab there on the top one. See if I can lift up with one and use my hand on the other. A bunch of Colorado mud in here, not helping to separate any better. There we go. Now we have our upper ball joint removed. We're going to go ahead and work on disconnecting our sway bar end links. Now typically you can do this upper one here, or you can do the lower one. A couple things to mention on this specific rig. We have a lift kit from Eurowise. You can probably see one of the fancy red spacers here on our subframe. There's also an additional piece here. Now what that does is it's changed the height of where this bolt would come out from, just enough where it's going to be kind of a pain in the butt. So I'm going to disconnect my sway bar end link from the sway bar itself. So let's go ahead and get that taken care of. It's going to be an 18 millimeter bolts, and you have one on each side, obviously. So I'm going to use a ratcheting wrench just to get that off. Now that that's done, our next step is going to be to free up this lower bolt that goes through the lower control arm. Now traditionally this would be a 21 millimeter head with a 21 millimeter nut on the other side. Because we have the lift kit, this hardware has changed, so our sizing is going to be a little different, but if your vehicle is stock, you should have a 21 on both sides. We have a 22 and a 21 on this specific car. All right, I'm going to use impact to get this bolt out. The kit does include new hardware for this bolt. However, because we have the lift kit, we're going to be reusing this one. Otherwise, you would want to use the new supplied hardware. Now that we have this freed up, our next step is going to be to head underneath the hood, find the strut tower, and work on removing the 3 bolts that hold the top of the strut mount in place. So let's get started with that. Now that we're under the hood, we're going to go ahead and remove these cowl pieces so we can get to our strut tower bolts. Typically you have a couple clips on these corners that hold these in. As you can see, ours is a little worse for wear. We have one on the engine bay side of things. One left, I should say. And take this cap off. And we should be able to pull this off. Kind of set that to the side for now. Put our cap back on for now. We have 2 more up top here on our cowl. Now, to make life easier for yourself, you could remove the whole cowl as you're doing both sides. However, for today's purpose, popping these up like this should be more than enough. Now our goal is going to be to find our 3 strut bolts, our 3 strut tower bolts. So let's go ahead and do that. We have one of our strut tower bolts hidden right in between the firewall and the coolant expansion tank. These are 3 16mm bolts. Now with everything freed up on top of the strut tower, we're going to go ahead and work on pulling out our strut. So for one, we can go ahead and move this over a little bit. Now I want to mention again, as I mentioned earlier, we do have a small lift kit on this. So these forks are going to be a little bit longer than your traditional strut on your vehicle. So you're going to see me wrestle this a little bit harder than necessary. Yours should come out nice and gently. Here we go, baby. All right, my good people, we got the strut on the table here. We're going to work on the bench, table, call it what you will. Our goal is 2 things. 1, to disconnect our headlight level sensor if you haven't done so already while it was in the wheel well. And 2, to remove this arm and replace it with our new one. So first things first, we're going to disconnect our headlight level sensor. There's a couple ways you can do it. You can undo the 10mm nut from the back side on one of the little ball joints, or you can simply use a punch and separate it from the arm itself, as we're going to have to install it onto our new arm. So I'm going to take my small punch and just punch out the locking pin that holds our plastic in place. Tap that out. Pin comes out the other side. Set that to the side. And then you can just pull off the connector. Set that to the side. With those off, next is going to be removing our 2 16mm bolts. I'm using a 16mm wrench to counterhold on one side. And I'm going to use an impact with a 16mm to zap off the 2 bolts. And again, like I mentioned in the wheel well, you'll see we have basically a 90-degree angle of where this naturally sits versus a strut being flat on the table. So when we install our new arm, we're going to try to make sure we torque them down to about the same angle. That way the bushings don't bind up. There's our nut and our old bolt. Again, the Myla arms come with new hardware, so we will not be reusing those. This, you want to make sure stays on the same side that you took it off of. Take that out. And out she comes. And just another thing to look at while we have these off, you can see our new ball joint. It's nice and firm. It's really not going anywhere. Obviously, with excessive pressure, it will. Versus our old ball joint, I mean, this is just finger strength. So it was tired, it was worn, it was time to get rid of it. So in the bin with these. Now let's get a new one on. So Honestly, it goes without saying, the install is the reverse of the removal. Tap those in. Take our new hardware, start with the outside one, and let's take our new bolt, start it through just a bit. Then I like to take my wrench and my new hardware, and I slip it into the wrench and then kind of just use it to hold so I can feed this bolt through and get it started on the other side. Now that I got a couple threads on here, let's hop over to the other side and do the same. With that lined up just a bit, don't forget to grab your level sensor bracket. It has a notch in it that keys into the top of the strut mount. Make sure that goes back the same way. Feed that through. And just like we did on the other side, I'm going to take my new nut, feed it into my wrench, and start it on this side. Now I'm just going to take my electric ratchet, you can use a regular ratchet for this, and snug up the hardware just a little bit so that I can still adjust this a bit, and then we'll torque it down properly. And same thing on this other side. And make sure our arm is at a height that we like. Now we're going to torque these down to 37 foot-pounds or 50 Newton meters, whichever you prefer. Again, I'm still counter holding with my 16mm wrench on the other side. Once that's tight, then it requires an additional 90 degrees. So I'm just going to make a mark with a paint marker, and then once I hit 90, I'll know I'm good and tight. Now that I have my blue mark, I'm going to go ahead and add 90 degrees. Boom, baby. Let's do the same thing on the other side. Now I'm going to make my mark for my 90 degree right there. A hair more. I would recommend you use a normal ratchet when you're doing something like this, when you're putting a degree on something, so you don't put too much wear and tear on your torque wrench. Because we're not doing too high of a torque value here, this will be okay. Now that we have our 90 on both sides, I'm just going to paint mark the hardware just so that I know if it ever comes apart or if it goes loose. Paint markers will help you do that. While I have you where you are, we're going to go ahead and reinstall our headlight level sensor bracket to the new control arm. It just feeds through. And take your plastic pin, feed it up, give it a couple love taps if you need to. And boom, baby. That is as far as we're going to get on the table here. Now the fun part is to feed this back into the vehicle and start hooking everything up before we get ready for the lower control arm. Now we're going to go ahead and reinstall the strut. This is what it should look like with our new upper control arm. And just, again, unrelated to most of your vehicles out there, but if you have a lift kit, you can see the difference in height between the stock end of the fork and the added kit. So this little bit does make a big difference when you're pulling this out. As you can see, I kind of struggled with it a little bit. That could also just be personal. Let's go ahead and feed this baby back in. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to try to lift up the strut a bit so that it kind of seats itself into the housing and the locating pins can do their job, locate the tower. And then at the same time, I'm going to try to feed the lower bolt back through the lower control arm just so that it holds everything up in place and I can get my top 3 bolts started in the strut tower. That should be enough. And then if need be, if you're working at home, put a floor jack underneath this and you can get it up the next inch or so you can start the 3 bolts up top. Now that this is situated, follow me back up top under the engine bay and we can feed our 3 16mm bolts back into the strut tower. Now back up top, we're going to go ahead and start our 3 16mm bolts back in. We're going to go ahead and torque these top 3 16mm bolts to 37 foot-pounds. There's 2. Beautiful. While I have you up here, we're going to go ahead and button up our cowl, starting with the 2 clips. Line them up into their respective places. Now we have our other cover. We're going to take our windshield washer cap back off. Now let's head back underneath and button up the rest of this upper control arm repair so that we can get ready to replace the lower one. All right, now that we have our strut secured up top, we're gonna go ahead and install the upper control arm ball joint end into the arm here. So I have a screw jack helping me kind of keep this up to a normal height so that I don't have to flex on this too much. If you're working on the garage at home, a floor jack will do the same thing. So I'm gonna pull this forward a hair, get the ball joint ready to feed through. Now that we have that started, I'm gonna get my impact gun and just use that to snug this back up, and then we'll torque it properly. There is a counter hold in the middle of the ball joint. Sometimes you can go ahead and get lucky and put the tapered end as much as possible so that the stud doesn't spin on you. Otherwise, if it does, we'll counter hold it. All right, so I got my 18 millimeter on the gun. We're gonna go ahead and snug this up. While I snug that up, I'm gonna pull down on the arm. That should be more than enough to be able to torque it down. We're gonna torque this down to 63 foot-pounds or 85 Newton meters, whichever you prefer. Beautiful. I'm just gonna use a paint pen to mark that, just so I know if it comes loose or anything. Do two. All right. Now let's get the car at a more level ride height, and then we'll work on reconnecting our airline and our electrical connectors that we did earlier. All right, with the ball joint situated, we're gonna work reverse of our removal, starting by installing our airline back in. You wanna be very careful with this one. You don't wanna accidentally strip it. If it's fighting you, stop, take a minute, come back to it. If you can, start the threads by hand. They're a little bit tough, but then we're just gonna snug it up. Again, I was using a 12 millimeter flared wrench for this. These do not need to be very tight. You don't wanna strip the brass fittings. They're not like brake lines that you wanna really snug on there. These are a lot more gentle. That's it, nice and snug. It's better to have it come loose than to strip it. Use a little paint pen just to make sure it does not come loose. And if it does, we'll be able to tell right away. Now that that's situated, let's work on reconnecting our electrical connectors and feeding our grommets through our holders. Now I'm going to start by reconnecting our level sensor. Give it a couple tugs, make sure it's not going to come out on you. It doesn't really give you a satisfying click as you'd wish, but you'll be able to tell if it's on there. Now let's head over to the forward side and reconnect our remainder items. They should still retain their shape of where they want to go based on how long they've been on the vehicle for. There's one. You have another grommet hidden behind here that holds it. Then you have this one that feeds over to your ABS sensor. One connection here plugs into the strut. Now that we have everything plugged into its respective homes, let's raise the car up and then we'll work on getting this lower control arm out. All right, my good people, you're gonna see me do something a little bit different here. Again, as we mentioned, this is lifted. We have a bunch of Eurowise goodies on here, including this 1/4-inch steel plate underneath. So I'm gonna go ahead and drop this really quick because I'm assuming that you do not have one on your vehicle. However, you know what they say about assumptions. So don't mind me, I'm gonna blast this down a little bit so we can clear this lower control arm. Then we'll get started on that replacement. Catch you in a minute. All right, my good people, my skid plate is out of the way. First thing of business here is going to be removing the nut on this ball joint end. So you're going to need a 21 millimeter socket for that. I'm going to put one on my impact and try to zap it off. Beautiful. With that off, I'm going to take a pickle fork and do my best job at splitting this. And again, if you remembered, we still have not connected the lower strut bolt yet, since this is all one job. So as you can see, we've been struggling a little bit on getting out this ball joint. You okay?
Hey, you. Finally awake.
Typically, it does not take this much effort or force to get these out. A good pickle fork and a good hammer will do the trick. At this point, I'm going to go ahead and upgrade to a bigger hammer. Give this knuckle a couple of whacks. As it is made out of steel, you're not really going to hurt anything. Just try to be careful not to nail your rotor or your caliper in the process. So let's get to it. Now with our ball joint free, we're gonna go ahead and remove our 2 inner eccentric bolts. Now before we do that, I like to take a paint marker and mark them, as well as mark a spot on the subframe, so that when I replace them with some new hardware, I can copy the line on my old eccentric bolt onto the new one, and then I can set the alignment on this. Again, it's gonna be a rough alignment just so that this can get to the shop and it's not tracking funny all over the place. So not a completely necessary step, but makes life easier for you if you're doing this at home. Just a line like that on the front, and then we'll do something similar on the back eccentric washer here. Beautiful. With that done, let's grab a couple wrenches and remove these 2 nuts and bolts. To undo these nut and bolts, you're going to need a 21 millimeter. I'm using 2 21 millimeter wrenches, one to counterhold and one to break free. Now, keep in mind when you're doing this, the counterhold is going to be on the side, usually the head side of the bolt, and then you're going to break free on the nut side. That way that can spin, because if you try to spin the head side of the bolt, the eccentric washer is built in, and you're going to risk damaging the subframe itself, and you're also not going to be able to spin it. So nut end first. Leave that in there for now. Let's head over to the front half and do the other side. Same thing as before, counter holding up front, breaking the nut free on the back. With both of those nuts off, now it's just a matter of pulling the bolts out. Make sure you pull off your eccentric on the back side, your eccentric washer, and launch your other bolt at the cameraman. Same thing with the other side, just popping the washer off the back, this little flathead. I'm going to keep this one so I can copy my mark onto the new one. So you just want to rotate the head of the bolt so that the eccentric part of the washer is facing down or away from the boot as best as possible. And there you have it. Now we're going to go ahead and pull our control arm out. You'll see this shield gets a little bit in our way. You shouldn't have this problem at home if you don't have that. With the arm dropped down, then it's just a matter of getting the ball joint out. Usually a twist towards the front of the vehicle like this gives you enough angle to clear this top part of the ball joint and pull it out. To install the new control arm, we're going to go ahead and start with the ball joint end first, just like we removed the old one. That one came out last. So the only thing you're going to see here that's a little bit different is I'm going to kind of wrestle this shield a little bit to clear it. If you're doing this at home, you should be able to just pop it right up. From here, you just want to push the arm back up into the subframe. It should stay for the most part. Grab your new hardware. The idea with the marks on the old one is so that you can go ahead and mark the new one to a similar fashion. So I'll show you what I mean. And again, this is very rough, but it's just to get it to the shop. So it'll look something like that. We'll put it back together. It won't be too far off. Get that started there and feed our back one in as well. I'm going to get my washer for the back side on both. I'm going to mark this back one since that's the one I marked on the old side. Just something like that. What I'm doing right now is making sure that my eccentric washer sits flush where it needs to go in the subframe. Sometimes you need to pry it a little bit. Pry the hardware forward and backwards until you can clear everything. Now it's nice and flush. We're going to go ahead and get our nuts started. We're going to go ahead and do the exact same thing to the front side. Now with both of our hardware in, we're going to go ahead and set the car at ride height. You can see I'm using a screw jack. If you're working at home, you can use a floor jack to do the same thing. I'm going off of my upper control arm. Basically a set ride height roughly is about a 90-degree angle on your upper arm. So with that done, now we can go ahead and tighten both of the bolts down. You're going to do 126 foot-pounds if you're doing this at home, or 170 Newton meters. We're just going to snug these up pretty good. We're taking it right to the alignment shop as soon as we're done here, so you're going to see us just stick to wrenches for now. And as you tighten, you want to make sure that your alignment marks stay where they are. There's the front. Let's do the same thing on the back. While I have this lifted up, this is not part of the procedure. You can do this with everything drooping. However, we're going to go ahead and install our ball joint nut while we have a good shot of it. This is a 21 millimeter. You're going to want to torque it down to 77.5 foot-pounds or 105 Newton meters, whichever you prefer. I'm going to snug it up with the impact first. I'm also going to hang on it a little bit so that the tapered end stay seated in the knuckle, so hopefully the stud doesn't spin on me. I was asking too much. There is a counter hold. Let me grab the Allen and we'll show you how to do that. To counter hold, you're going to need a 6mm hex. I'm going to use my 21mm wrench. With the 21mm snugged up, we're going to go ahead and torque it down to 77.5 foot-pounds. All right, my good people, at this point, we're ready to install our lower strut bolt. Now, at home, if you're following along on a stock application, you should be seeing your lower strut forks lining up almost perfectly with the lower control arm eye hole for the bushing. So you would just simply slide your 21mm bolt through. Give us a brief moment. We have a lift on ours, so we're going to go ahead and wrangle it in. And once we do, we'll get to the torque specs. See you in a second. We have our bolt through. We're going to go ahead and install our nut on the other side. This is a 21mm nut. We're going to go ahead and tighten down this 21mm nut to 63 foot-pounds or 85 Newton meters, whichever way you prefer. I'm going to go ahead and snug this up with the gun real quick. This is, on our case, a 22. Like I mentioned earlier, you should have a 21mm head on both ends. With this snug up, we're going to go ahead and counter hold on this end and torque down with our ratchet. What else would you torque down with? Again, 63, it's not a whole lot. We're going to go ahead and reconnect our sway bar back to our sway bar end link, and then put our wheel and shield back up and wrap up this DIY. So at this point, our last thing to install is the sway bar end link. Again, as I mentioned at the beginning, you could either disconnect it from the top of the strut or the sway bar. We chose the sway bar just due to the way our lift kit's set up and tomato. What I'm going to do now is use a screw jack. If you're doing this at home, use a floor jack. I'm going to compress the suspension up so that my sway bar end link lines up with the end of the sway bar, and then we'll put that bolt in and wrap up this Johnson. With this snug up, we're going to go ahead and torque it to 81.5 foot-pounds. Beautiful. At this point, we have gone ahead and made sure that all our electricals are back on, all our bolts are tight, torqued, paint marked, all that good stuff. It's time to put the fender liner back on. Once you get it kind of tucked up, I'm going to start with my two 10mm plastic nuts. That way it kind of holds it roughly in place. And then we'll send our T25s back in. Now all that's left is for our wheel to go back on. So let's get that ready. You have 5 17mm lug bolts. All that's left to do is torque down our lug bolts. I'm going to go ahead and torque these down to 95 foot-pounds. And there you have it, my good people, another DIY in the books. A couple takeaways from this job. Again, as we mentioned earlier, this does have a small lift kit on it, so some of the tolerances and the lengths of some of the parts that we were touching today were a little bit different, so your view might be a little bit skewed and also hopefully easier back at home. And we did work on the passenger side today. The driver's side is going to be identical. The process is going to be the same. If you like this video, please be sure to give it a thumbs up. If you have any questions or comments on what we did today, leave it in the comment box below. And if you like this DIY and you want to see more like them, please consider subscribing. We make new ones all the time. And if you want to learn a little bit more about this Cayenne and what it's gone through, be sure to click the build series on the description box below. As always, thank you for watching. We'll catch you in the next one.